The historic town of Jacksonville, located just west of Medford. This former Southern Oregon boomtown finds itself today as a National Historic Landmark. On this episode of Exploregon, we look at the people and the place called Jacksonville. In the 1840s and 50s, the discovery of gold created towns in the West almost overnight. In 1851, James Cluggage and John R. Poole discovered gold in southern Oregon's Daisy Creek. And with this news, the town of Jacksonville, or Table Rock City as it was first called, was born.
In 1851, when Cluggage and Poole came through here with their pack train, they stopped off here in Jacksonville to take a look at the grasses. They just wanted a place to camp and take care of their animals. And when one of the animals, at least this is the way one of the story goes, they reached down, and when the mule picked up a clump of grass, there were spangles on the bottom of it. And so this really got them excited. And there'd been rumors that gold was found in this area, but not too many people had heard about it yet. But there were lots of rumors. And so they didn't know where they were. They didn't know if they were in California or if they were in the Oregon Territory. So they took off to the nearest town, which was Wairika, headed south, went in there and actually filed a claim on the property right near here at Rich Gulch. And typical, they went out and blabbed. One of them got drunk, one of them went and talked to a newspaper, and by 1852, the early part of 1852, there were actually newspaper articles showing up in a Wairika paper.
There were a lot of people already mining in California, in Wairika and areas around San Francisco and Sacramento and that area. And there were people obviously up in the northern part of the state who heard about this, and they rushed to the gold fields here. And from that, Table Rock City became a tent city. There were many tents set up, but not a lot of actual structures. There was a log building set up and then some stores, and many Jewish merchants heard about Jacksonville or Table Rock City, and they decided to set up shop here and sell hardware and mining supplies. The miners would come into town and buy some clothing and use their gold dust to buy this clothing in the clothing stores, and because they had no use for these secondhand clothes, or they didn't need two sets of clothes, they would just simply put out their clothes on the streets, and those who were desperately in need of clothing, especially those who had just come across the plains and maybe their clothes were worn out, could just pick them up off the streets. There was a bowling alley here. There were several saloons before there were any churches. Some of the descriptions of the people who actually came to settle here and felt that they were a little bit on a better class of people than the miners made comments about how the miners were not really willing to invest in the community itself to build up churches or schools or that sort of thing. They were just here to take what they could from the land, and then they would leave. They would move on and go somewhere else.
You had a rather rough, tough element, meaning gold miners, whose occupation was basically to go from new strike to new strike. The law situation, law enforcement, there really wasn't much to be said for law enforcement. It was more sort of vigilante type situation. A miner jumps another miner's claim, then there's just, immediate retribution or whatever. So they did decide that they must do something about the situation right away, and a temporary courthouse was actually set up in a tent, and they started fashioning laws.
The Table Rock discovery brought miners from all parts of the world, including many of the Chinese, who, like others, were looking for their chance at wealth in this new town.
The Chinese were here very early on because they had already been in San Francisco area anyway, and when they heard about the mining that went on here, they would come and form companies and were often more willing to do hard work and go for little tiny bits and small payoffs that other people were not willing to do.
The Chinese were very efficient about the work they did. They came to this country not to stay, not to be a part of our culture. They had their own. They wanted to come here, acquire a certain amount of wealth, and go back home and be able to do well in their areas of China where they lived.
They would come in and mine and remine areas that the white folk left and they'd come back to town with little sacks of gold. And this made the miners very angry because they were stealing the gold, they thought, somewhere. And all they were doing was just moving the dirt over one more time, or two more times, or three more times, and they were willing to work up here really hard.
It created some tension. People were very prejudiced against the Chinese. There were laws in Oregon that were targeted to tax the Chinese more than the white settlers. In the town of Jacksonville, there was a section down by where Peter Britt's house was on the main street of town that was called Chinatown, and most of the shacks that were built there were occupied by Chinese people.
A lot of these miners that were able to write and read, they ended up writing to newspapers, and it's difficult to tell really oftentimes how much gold was found in certain areas because they either had a tendency to exaggerate, or on the other hand, they didn't want to let the cat out of the bag because they wanted to be back there finding more gold. Well, in about 1860, when this fellow found gold around what is now known as Gold Hill, some fellow wrote in and said it would probably, to a newspaper, stated that this would be the best time to take, a census, because practically everyone from the whole area was there to see the new strike.
They were people from all walks of life, from all over the world. We had a large group of German immigrants who came here, who heard about the mining. Peter Britt was from Switzerland. He came to America, to Illinois, in the early 1850s or late 1840s, and settled with the other group of Swiss immigrants. And because at that time, portrait painting really wasn't the going thing. You could not make a very good living at it. So he came just at the right time to learn this new trade of photography. He's believed to be one of the first, if not the first, photographer who actually brought his photographic equipment across the plains. When he got here, Table Rock City was not much to look at, and he was really interested in mining. But he did set up a photographic studio. It had a little sunroof or a skylight on it, and so that he could get the light for the photographs. And he began taking pictures, but he always maintained this interest in the mining. He thought he could probably make more money that way, when in actuality he found out much later that the rocker that he had made for mining was built in the wrong direction, and most of the sediment just passed right through the rocker instead of retaining it. So I think that was a sign to him that he was in the wrong business. He was the first person to take a picture of Crater Lake. He went up there in the 1870s and took photographs, and as a result, some of those photographs made it all the way back to Washington, D.C., and Crater Lake became a national park. Without his photographs, we would not have the knowledge that we do today, and it's very uncommon for one little town in Oregon to have such a a consistent photographic record from the very beginning of the town up until 1905 when he died. Mr. Beekman, who came here in the 1850s, started out as a miner. He never was very successful at it. It was very difficult work, and you get cold, you get hungry, you could lose your life. And I think that he began to develop a business sense that, and really come into his own. He came to Table Rock City and started transporting gold that the miners had gotten out of the ground, and he would take it by horseback, by himself, with his guns, and go during the night so he wouldn't be robbed or harmed in any way. Everybody knew he was carrying money, but it was their money, so they weren't about to rob him or hurt him in any way.
Early 1860s, he decided that he would open his own banking house here in Jacksonville instead of running the gold, and he built this bank in 1863. He would then take the miners' gold and he would charge them a fee to send it down to San Francisco. Gold, of course, wasn't really worth anything unless you got it out of here, so he would charge them a fee to do that.
Eventually, he became a Wells Fargo agent for that company, and delivered not only gold but other goods and packages and supplies and passengers, and he kept a meticulous record. Most of those records are still in existence today, and we can find out, track him day by day what he was doing and where he was going.
By 1853, religion was beginning to surface in town, softening some of the wild reputation that Jacksonville had been known for. In 1854, the Methodist Church became the first church to be built in town, with the help of active settlers and the money donated by a few of the miners. Other churches would soon follow.
They started to organize and started to try and form a church. Moses Williams was an early preacher here, and there was also a Catholic congregation here fairly early, and a group of people from all over the world, but a lot from Ireland and that sort of thing, who wanted to form that kind of church. And we have the Catholic Church and the Catholic Rectory that are still standing today.
In 1869, the area experienced a smallpox epidemic. Friends, family members were so frightened that there are stories of almost abandonment. There was no one to count on because the epidemic was so deadly, the smallpox was so deadly, that within hours, days, people were dying. They would contract the illness and they were dead. But it was a very painful death. The town citizens thought that if they started many fires, that the smoke would actually kill these germs. Well, it didn't. It made for a smoky Jacksonville with a very gloomy atmosphere. Tavalt, that was the publisher of the first newspaper in the area, contracted the illness and was said to have been very upset by the situation, since he had survived fighting on the battlefield and that sort of thing, and this terrible disease he contracted killed him, and he was actually the last to die. It was a very devastating time for all the citizens of Jacksonville.
In 1880, commotion was again taking place in Jacksonville. However, this time in anticipation of a visit from the 19th President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes.
President Rutherford B. Hayes was making a trip from San Francisco to Portland with his entourage, and on his itinerary, Jacksonville was listed as a stop. When the party that went ahead to sort of see what the situation was, the accommodations were not suitable for the president and his entourage. And Madam Holt had, there had been a big celebration with the new hotel that her husband had been constructing for her. And they'd had a 4th of July celebration, a ball in the second floor ballroom. And yet the hotel was not complete in September of 1880 when Hayes arrived. And since they knew he was on his way, there was quite an effort to slap some paint on the walls and make it presentable for the president. And the story goes that when he arrived, the smell of fresh paint, the fumes were practically overpowering. They gathered together some furniture because the furniture really, that Madam Holt had not purchased the furniture for the hotel yet. So there seems to be a situation where Hayes complained about bed bugs. The next morning, his businessman was presented the bill from Madam Holt, and the bill was for $100. And the story goes that his businessman said, "Madam Holt, I did not plan on buying the hotel, only paying for lodging." So that's the big story with the U.S. Hotel, is the president slept here. When the news of the railroad coming to the Rogue Valley was causing a lot of excitement in the area, Jacksonville decided they were, after all, the county seat, and the railroad would most certainly be routed through Jacksonville or close by. Unfortunately, the railroad didn't see it that way, and I think a lot of it had to do actually with the lay of the land. Geographically, there was a flat valley to build through, which would be less expensive, and so the railroad went to a group of people in Jacksonville and presented the situation that we will build closer to Jacksonville for X amount of dollars, supposedly around $20,000 or a bit more. And the citizens of Jacksonville, for the most part, thought, well, we're the county seat, we're the only game in town, they will build in Jacksonville. But they didn't. They didn't get the money, and ONC decided to take the easy way and build through the valley, and that's how Medford was born.
Beekman actually found the town site. He was one of the founders of Medford. And he and a group of businessmen got together, and they saw that Jacksonville was going to be missed. So they went out there and they talked the farmers into selling huge portions. They platted out the land, blocked it out, put the streets in on paper, and then promised the railroad every other lot and every other block, I guess it was, so that they would entice them in. So when the railroad came into town, they owned almost half the town.
They took advantage of a good business situation, and yet C.C. Beekman, the banker, stayed in Jacksonville. He was there to serve that community. He'd watched it grow, he had helped it grow, and he stayed in Jacksonville. And for a time, that was the only bank in Southern Oregon.
The bypassing of the railroad dealt a crippling blow to the town and residents of Jacksonville. The railroad was the future, and the future had just passed them by. In one last attempt to try and keep Jacksonville in the loop, a railway between Jacksonville and Medford was created with much enthusiasm from both towns. The run, however, had problems from the beginning of operation, as the elevation difference created too much pull for the underpowered engine. Despite a new, stronger engine, financial problems still loomed, as the much-anticipated freight business had not lived up to expectation and was unable to offset the fuel expense needed to make the costly uphill pull into Jacksonville. Even though passenger service was in demand, it didn't generate near the revenue needed, and even that demand had begun to diminish with the advent of the automobile.
About 1900, the glory days of Jacksonville were gone. A lot of the movers and shakers in Jacksonville had moved to Medford. That's where things were really starting to happen. And about that same time, the orchard boom was just beginning. And Jacksonville didn't have the railroad, and they're at the base of mountain ranges, And so the flat land was much easier also to plant. Because of the soil being so rich, great for grains, great for deciduous fruit type trees, orchards, many orchards sprung up around, apples, pears, almonds, walnuts, you name it, all sorts of fruits. So the population started to shift, and Jacksonville just really was in what was known as the doldrums. And for many, many years, Jacksonville in the Rogue Valley was really known as the low rent district.
During the Depression years in Jacksonville, residents looked to a unique yet familiar source to help them through these difficult times that were facing the nation.
Many of the citizens had been there for many, many years, and they realized that there was still gold in them there hills, and underneath even their own homes, in their yards.
They didn't know what else to do because these men were getting desperate, and somebody happened to drive a shaft down in their backyard. You say, well, let's check this thing out, and came up with gold. Not a lot, but enough to make it worthwhile, a couple dollars a day. Hey, that was better than starving. That bought beans, and this gold dust economy was going on, so they didn't even have to take it to the mint. They could just take it down to a store and sell it directly to the man there and get sausage or whatever else they needed.
One character here in town had gone down the street, and what was well, actually the Lions Club, I guess, had the building, had gone up underneath the corner of it, and it finally sunk in. They had to fill it up, but he had dug quite a hole there.
I have talked to people person after person who told me these stories of they'd wake up the next morning, this was in the 1930s, and they'd look out and their backyard would collapse. And I remember Ray Lewis telling me the story of how his dad went out there, saw it, crawled down in there, followed it out, crossed his yard alongside the Methodist Church, across 5th Street, over to the museum, the courthouse then, and found the guy that was doing it. So Ray said his dad went up to him really angrily and said, I want half of whatever you took out of my yard. And he got $300, and that's what sent Ray off to college and became a school teacher.
The circus for many, many children and adults alike was one of the really exciting events of the year. And Pinto Colvig got very fascinated with the circus and actually did a little stint with various circuses. He had a lot of practice clowning around even in his Sunday school class and that sort of thing early on in Jacksonville. And so it was sort of a natural thing for him to just become a clown. And he's best known for being the first Bozo the Clown. And Pinto was also a very, very good artist. Later on, he actually became a cartoonist and worked for newspapers and also for Walt Disney Studios.
In the 1960s, plans were being laid to reroute Highway 238 through a large section of Jacksonville, wiping out many of the historic buildings. An historic preservation movement was created to try and save the town.
There were a number of people that were interested in seeing Jacksonville listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and it really sort of took wings and was in newspapers around the country and was getting a lot of interest nationally. The old hotel was refurbished and is also a bank now.
The older houses were being restored. The downtown area has never been restored. It's still just like it was. Those buildings you see down there are just like they were. Nobody's done a whole lot to them. But Jacksonville started becoming more and more famous as a tourist destination as people came here and said, hey, we'd like to live here.
The lure of gold still brings people to Jacksonville today, but instead of a pickaxe, they bring cameras. The gold of yesteryear brings tourism into town. In fact, it's become Jacksonville's leading industry these days. Among the favorites is the Jacksonville Cemetery, where many of the people of the time are buried, as well as tours of the C.C. Beekman Bank that amazingly hasn't been altered since 1915. The charm of Jacksonville's past is what drives its future.
I like Jacksonville to be thought of as a town that had enough foresight to preserve its past. Jacksonville should be remembered by the amount of work it took to hack this place out of the wilderness. You can't believe what those people went through to accomplish what they did and build their fine homes and their grand buildings. That was very difficult.
I'd like to see Jacksonville left as a pioneer town like it originally was. I hope that we can keep enough of it to preserve it so that it does have the character that it did have.
You have the quiet, rustic, sort of sleepy town atmosphere, not so much the gold rush days, but you see the buildings and that sort of thing. So really, Jacksonville is a reminder of the rich history of Oregon and how we must protect it and how it's a benefit not only now, but in the future for our children and our children's children.